When the public thinks of Jackie Kennedy's tragic losses, they immediately picture the assassination in Dallas. But the historical record reveals a far more brutal timeline of physical devastation. In 1956, she lay hemorrhaging in a hospital bed. Her infant was dead. Her husband, Senator John F. Kennedy, was partying on a yacht in the Mediterranean. The Kennedy political machine faced total collapse if she filed for divorce. Instead of leaving, she sat down at the negotiating table with her father-in-law. $1 million in cash was deposited into a private trust fund. According to biographers, massive financial penalties were drafted into the agreement if her husband brought home further venereal diseases. Long before she became a Kennedy, she was Jacqueline Lee Bouvier. Born in 1929, she dropped directly into the elite circles of New York society just weeks before the catastrophic Wall Street crash. From the beginning, her father, John Black Jack Bouvier, publicly favored Jacqueline over her younger sister Lee. He explicitly declared her the most beautiful daughter a man could have. This blatant favoritism planted the seed for a lifelong, ruthless competition between the sisters. Her family maintained an aristocratic illusion built on deception and debt. Her primary survival lesson derived directly from witnessing her mother, Janet Lee, utilize private detectives and honey traps to secure absolute legal and social victory over her father in their 1940 divorce. When the divorce was finalized in 1940, the 11-year-old Jacqueline internalized a principle that defined her existence. A woman's true independence relied not on emotional vulnerability, but on the capacity to compartmentalize humiliation and seize the levers of power. Her psychological response was total emotional withdrawal. Driven by an intense pride, she developed an obsessive need to maintain absolute control over her inner life. She refused to show distress, crying only when completely alone. She retreated into classical literature and became fiercely dedicated to equestrian sports. The equestrian arena provided strict physical discipline and absolute control over a powerful, unpredictable animal, serving as the exact opposite of her chaotic domestic life. Jeanette Lee rapidly secured her financial future by marrying Hugh D. Auchincloss, an immensely wealthy Standard Oil heir. This marriage moved the family into massive, heavily staffed estates in Virginia and Rhode Island. Jacqueline deeply resented this pragmatic maneuver, remaining fiercely loyal to her ruined father. When the wedding day arrived, the 11-year-old staged a physical protest. She flatly refused to attend the ceremony. She used her deliberate absence as a weapon to punish her mother, refusing to speak about the event afterward. She had learned early to compartmentalize humiliation, to weaponize her own silence, and to project a flawless composure regardless of the private circumstances. Those exact psychological defenses would soon attract the attention of a political patriarch who was quietly shopping for a very specific type of asset to place next to his son. By 1951, the 22-year-old Jacqueline Bouvier had perfected her aristocratic armor. She had spent her formative years watching her mother surgically dismantle her father's life to secure financial stability. She understood intimately that for a woman of her social standing in the mid-20th century, survival depended entirely on the strategic acquisition of a powerful man, superseding any academic brilliance or professional ambition. At 22, Jacqueline won Vogue magazine's prestigious Prix de Paris competition, but resigned on her first day. A senior editor warned her that a corporate career would isolate her from wealthy men. She listened. Her first attempt at this merger was a brief engagement to Wall Street banker John Husted. Within 3 months, she returned his ring. She recognized that his comfortable, predictable life lacked the world-shaping ambition she required. She sought a stage large enough to validate her psychological endurance. Viewing marriage merely as the necessary vehicle, that stage arrived in May 1952 at a private dinner party hosted by the journalist Charles Bartlett and his wife, Martha. It was here that she was formally introduced to the young congressman from Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The myth of Camelot dictates that this was a moment of profound, immediate romance. The historical record dictates otherwise. Jacqueline's private assessment of the future president of the United States was ruthlessly clinical. In a private journal entry detailing her first impressions, she did not write about his legendary charm or his political vision. She focused entirely on his physical flaws. She noted with a sharp, almost mocking detachment that he had a funny body, skinny with legs like toothpicks. She saw past the political veneer immediately. She recognized that Jack was physically compromised, suffering from severe, chronic back pain and hidden Addison's disease, often requiring crutches behind closed doors. She also recognized something far more familiar, the aggressive, predatory gaze of a chronic philanderer. Jack was already notorious in Washington for his relentless pursuit of young women. He possessed the exact same destructive habits as her father, but there was one crucial difference. Jack was backed by the most formidable political machine in American history, controlled by his father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the true architect of the Kennedy-Bouvier Union, was unequivocally Joe Sr. The Kennedy patriarch was a man of staggering wealth and ruthless political calculation. Despite his millions, his time as an ambassador, and his relentless networking, Joe Sr. could not erase the fact that the American Protestant elite viewed his family as rough, working-class Irish Catholic outsiders. He had spent his life fighting anti-Catholic prejudice, and he was determined that his sons would conquer the highest offices in the land. To achieve this, Jack needed camouflage. He needed a wife who could instantly legitimize him in the eyes of the old money establishment. He required a highly specific type of political prop rather than a traditional partner. When Joe Sr. met Jacqueline Bouvier, he analyzed her as if she were a blue-chip stock. He knew her biological father was a ruined alcoholic. He knew her stepfather held the real money. But her brand was absolutely flawless. She spoke breathless, aristocratic French. She rode championship horses. She possessed an ethereal, unreadable composure that made her look like European royalty. She was the perfect aristocratic shield to soften his son's aggressive, hypersexualized Irish political edge. The courtship that followed was devoid of traditional romance. Jack was consumed with his grueling campaign for the United States Senate. He was frequently absent, deeply distracted, and actively continuing his affairs with other women while supposedly courting Jacqueline. She was acutely aware of his infidelities. Driven by a cold, calculating pride, she ignored the disrespect, evaluating the power of the system he represented rather than his fidelity. It is widely documented by Kennedy historians that Joe Sr. eventually grew impatient with his son's hesitation. The patriarch practically ordered Jack to propose, viewing the marriage as a necessary prerequisite for a national political ticket. Jack finally proposed over the telephone and via telegram while Jacqueline was on assignment in London as a photographer for the Washington Times-Herald. Most women of the era would have accepted the proposal of a young, wealthy senator immediately. Jacqueline did not. She deployed her favorite weapon, silence. She made him wait for a full 30 days. She traveled through Europe, letting the offer hang in the air. This was a calculated power play. She was establishing that she was not a desperate debutante grateful for an acquisition. She was entering a partnership where she held distinct leverage. When she finally returned to the United States and accepted the ring, a massive emerald and diamond piece selected not by Jack, but by Joe Sr., the machinery of the Kennedy Empire immediately took over. The wedding, held on September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island, was the physical manifestation of this corporate merger. It was entirely orchestrated by Joe Kennedy Sr. as a massive political rally disguised as a religious sacrament. Joe Sr. dictated every aesthetic detail of the event, ensuring the bride looked traditionally magnificent, like a piece of monumental architecture easily visible from the back of a massive cathedral. The event itself was an exercise in physical endurance. Joe Sr. had invited the entire power structure of the United States. There were 700 guests packed into St. Mary's Church. The reception at the Auchincloss estate, Hammersmith Farm, swelled to over 1,200 people, including senators, governors, Hollywood executives, and corporate titans. For 3 continuous hours, the 24-year-old bride stood in the receiving line under the blazing September sun. The heavy silk taffeta dress was suffocating. She shook hands with thousands of strangers, smiling perfectly, while the heavy, repetitive gripping physically bruised her knuckles. The public and the press were completely mesmerized. They saw a fairy tale romance, the crowning of a new American prince and princess. They saw youth, beauty, and limitless potential. The private reality was starkly different. As they departed for their honeymoon in Acapulco, the terms of the acquisition were fully cemented. Jack spent the vast majority of the romantic getaway locked in their suite, reading dense political biographies and suffering from debilitating back spasms that left him completely immobilized. Jacqueline spent the honeymoon realizing the absolute totality of the cage she had just walked into. She had secured the ultimate prize of the 1950s marriage market. She was now a Kennedy. She had access to limitless wealth and the highest echelons of global power. But the contract she had signed with the Kennedy patriarch was not a standard marital agreement. The toll for her position would not be paid in social appearances or political smiles. Over the next 3 years, the true cost of her husband's reckless, secretive lifestyle would be extracted directly from her own body, plunging her into a hidden medical nightmare of blood, surgical steel, and silent, darkened hospital rooms. August 1956. A 78-foot luxury yacht slices through the Mediterranean Sea. On board, a 39-year-old United States Senator, John F. Kennedy, is hosting a floating bachelor party surrounded by a rotating cast of young female companions. Thousands of miles away, in Newport, Rhode Island, his 27-year-old wife is collapsing in agony. She is rushed into the emergency ward of Newport Hospital. She is hemorrhaging severely. Her body is in the violent mechanical process of delivering a dead infant. The public record states the senator was on a vital European fact-finding mission following his defeat for the vice presidential nomination at the Democratic National Convention. The historical reality reveals a man actively fleeing the domestic consequences of his own lifestyle. When informed that his wife was in critical condition and their daughter born dead, he initially refused to return, deciding the tragedy was already over and he intended to finish his vacation on the water. The trauma of Jacqueline Kennedy is often evaluated strictly through the lens of emotional infidelity, overshadowing the brutal, physical toll extracted directly from her body. The 1950s represented a dangerous era for female reproductive health. Penicillin existed, yet the medical establishment possessed a dangerously limited understanding of asymptomatic sexually transmitted diseases. Pathogens such as chlamydia were not routinely tested for. Gonorrhea was frequently misdiagnosed in women. JFK's sexual appetite functioned as a compulsive, reckless pathology. His liaisons extended far beyond discreet, high-society mistresses, frequently involving transient political groupies and high-end sex workers. In an era before broad-spectrum antibiotic prophylaxis, this behavior constituted a biological Russian roulette. Medical historians and investigative biographers analyzing Jackie's catastrophic obstetric history point to a highly probable clinical reality. Jack's relentless, unprotected encounters likely resulted in him contracting venereal infections, which he subsequently transmitted to his wife. Inside a woman's body, untreated venereal infections fester into pelvic inflammatory disease. This infection aggressively scars the fallopian tubes, damages the uterine lining, and creates a highly toxic environment for a developing fetus. It acts as a direct, mechanical catalyst for chronic miscarriages, premature rupture of membranes, and late-term stillbirths. Some medical historians suggest that Jacqueline may have been actively carrying the microscopic, destructive consequences of his political and personal recklessness inside her own reproductive organs. The physical devastation commenced almost immediately after the wedding. In 1955, she suffered months of excruciating abdominal cramps. Her elite doctors casually dismissed the pain as standard female hysteria, a common diagnosis of the era. She subsequently suffered a massive miscarriage. Before the yacht trip in 1956, Jack had spent weeks exhausting himself at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. He had mounted a desperate, aggressive floor fight to win the vice presidential nomination. He lost. Exhausted and humiliated, he immediately departed for Europe, leaving his heavily pregnant wife behind. Jacqueline had spent the convention sequestered in her mother's estate, Hammersmith Farm in Newport, watching the political maneuvering on television. The stress of his political gambling directly preceded her physical collapse. When the bleeding started, the local Newport doctors were ill-equipped for a severe obstetric emergency. The surgical intervention was frantic. Arabella was delivered dead, and Jacqueline required immediate blood transfusions. Her mother, Janet Auchincloss, meticulously managed the optics of the tragedy. Janet instructed the hospital staff to keep the press completely uninformed until a sterilized narrative could be crafted. The priority was not the grieving mother, but the political fallout. When Jacqueline woke up in the sterile recovery room, groggy from the heavy ether used in 1950s obstetrics, the man sitting beside her hospital bed was her brother-in-law, Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby had rushed to the hospital to manage the immediate crisis, while his brother sailed the Mediterranean. Jack only agreed to return from Europe after his close friend, Senator George Smothers, delivered a blunt political threat. Smothers explicitly warned him that abandoning a grieving, hospitalized wife would completely and permanently destroy his chances of ever running for the presidency. Jack flew back for political preservation. This event pushed Jacqueline to her absolute breaking point. Her fatal pride could no longer compartmentalize the humiliation. Enduring private infidelity was an accepted hazard among the aristocratic elite. Being abandoned to bleed out in a hospital ward while her husband partied on a yacht constituted an intolerable public degradation. As she physically recovered, her psychological withdrawal became absolute. She spent weeks confined to her bed in Newport, staring blankly at the walls, refusing to engage with the political operatives, constantly calling the house. The physical trauma of the cesarean section was compounded by the silence from her husband. When Jack finally arrived, his attempts at comfort were described by insiders as awkward and deeply disconnected. He treated the stillbirth as a temporary political setback rather than a devastating personal loss. She completely severed communication with him. Behind closed doors, she bypassed marital counselors entirely and began consulting high-powered lawyers. She prepared the paperwork to file for divorce. A divorce in 1956 would have instantly detonated the Kennedy political machine. A divorced Catholic politician possessed zero mathematical chance of securing a presidential nomination in the mid-20th century. The illusion of the romantic marriage was stripped away, replaced by a cold, corporate negotiation orchestrated by Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. The Kennedy patriarch recognized the catastrophic threat to his grand design. He bypassed emotional appeals. He never asked her to forgive his son. Joe Sr. understood that his daughter-in-law was a product of the Bouvier-Auchincloss worldview, pragmatic, cynical, and highly responsive to concrete leverage. According to extensive research by investigative biographers, Joe Sr. arranged a private meeting with Jacqueline and laid out a brutally transactional offer. He proposed a binding, silent contract. If Jacqueline agreed to drop the divorce proceedings, remain in the marriage, and continue executing the role of the devoted political wife, he would personally deposit $1 million in tax-free cash into a trust fund strictly in her name. The negotiation required additional stipulations. Jacqueline remained acutely aware of the medical reality destroying her reproductive system. She countered with a demand that explicitly exposed the terrifying biological hazards of their bedroom. Multiple unauthorized biographies report the contract included a punitive medical clause. If Jack brought home any venereal disease from his mistresses and infected her again, the financial penalty would instantly skyrocket. The Kennedy patriarch would be forced to pay her $20 million. She took the money. In doing so, the fundamental nature of her existence shifted permanently. She ceased being a naive debutante attempting to reform a charismatic senator. She evolved into a highly compensated co-conspirator within a massive political fraud. Joe Sr. deeply respected her for this maneuver, viewing her ruthless pragmatism as a direct mirror of his own corporate ruthlessness. She accepted that her physical safety and her reproductive organs were now collateral in the Kennedy syndicate's race for the White House. This emotional void triggered her survival instincts. She realized that relying on Jack for emotional stability was a terminal mistake. The $1 million trust fund negotiated with Joe Sr. provided the exact mechanism she needed to sever her emotional dependency. She used the capital to physically isolate herself within the marriage. She leased separate residences, traveled independently, and hired her own loyal staff who answered exclusively to her, not to the Kennedy political machine. With her financial independence entirely secured, she channeled her suppressed fury into absolute aesthetic dominance. She began acquiring imported French couture, obsessively renovating historical properties, and constructing the flawless, untouchable visual persona that would soon hypnotize the global public. She transformed her public role from a supportive wife into an independent political asset. She recognized that her unique aesthetic and her aristocratic composure were highly effective weapons on the campaign trail. She began giving interviews in fluent French, Spanish, and Italian, targeting specific immigrant voting blocs that the Kennedy machine needed to secure. She was no longer just standing beside him. She was actively managing her own distinct brand within the campaign. The public perceived a devoted partnership. The reality was a highly compartmentalized, purely transactional alliance. Up to this point, the arrangement held a fragile, cold equilibrium. She had secured her boundaries and her finances. Then the 1960 presidential campaign commenced, bringing a level of physical exhaustion and public scrutiny that shattered all previous coping mechanisms. The transition from senatorial wife to first lady required a stamina that natural adrenaline could not provide. The fortress she had built with Joe Sr.'s money was about to be breached by the clinical demands of the White House. Maintaining a flawless smile, enduring the relentless, crushing schedule of the campaign trail, and standing beside a man whose private behavior physically endangered her required extreme chemical intervention. That specific requirement would soon lead her directly into the waiting room of a Manhattan physician whose syringes would plunge the highest office in the land into a classified hallucinogenic nightmare. January 1961. The inaugural balls have concluded. The Kennedy administration occupies the White House. The public consumes a meticulously crafted narrative of youthful vigor, intellectual brilliance, and perfect domestic harmony. The visual brand of Camelot is broadcast globally. Behind the reinforced doors of the executive mansion, the physiological reality of the president and the first lady is entirely dependent on a classified chemical regimen. The transition from a senatorial spouse to the most scrutinized woman on the planet required a level of physical and psychological stamina that Jacqueline Kennedy simply did not possess naturally. She was fundamentally introverted. She despised loud crowds, aggressive reporters, and the relentless physical demands of retail politics. The exhaustion of the 1960 campaign had completely depleted her. She required an external solution to maintain the impenetrable aristocratic facade she had constructed. She found that solution in a cluttered, unsterile medical office on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Dr. Max Jacobson was a German émigré physician known among elite theatrical and political circles by a blunt pseudonym, Dr. Feelgood. Jacobson did not prescribe standard rest or conventional therapies. He administered bespoke intravenous injections. He claimed his formulas were highly advanced mixtures of vitamins, animal organ cells, and placenta. Medical analysts and federal investigators later revealed the exact composition of these syringes. They were heavily laced with liquid methamphetamine, steroids, and potent painkillers. Jacqueline Kennedy became a patient of Dr. Jacobson in late 1960, shortly before the election. The injections provided an immediate, overwhelming surge of euphoria, supreme confidence, and boundless physical energy. The crippling social anxiety vanished instantly. Under the influence of Jacobson's methamphetamine mixtures, she could stand on receiving lines for hours, smile flawlessly at hostile foreign dignitaries, and project an image of effortless grace. John F. Kennedy rapidly incorporated Jacobson into his own medical team. The president was in chronic, agonizing pain from a deteriorating spine and suffered from Addison's disease. The White House physician, Dr. Janet Travel, administered procaine injections directly into his back muscles, but it was Jacobson's amphetamine cocktails that kept the president functioning on a global stage. The dependency escalated quickly. Jacobson was granted extraordinary, undocumented access to the White House. The Secret Service, tasked with protecting the president from foreign adversaries, stood by in the corridors while an unlicensed physician pumped Schedule II narcotics directly into the bloodstreams of the first couple. During the high-stakes 1961 summit in Vienna, where JFK faced the aggressive Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev, Jacobson was secretly smuggled into the presidential suite to administer injections multiple times a day. The physical manifestations of this chemical dependency were stark. Staff members noted the president's sudden bouts of hyper-alertness followed by periods of deep, irritable exhaustion. Jacqueline exhibited the classic signs of amphetamine cycling, periods of intense, laser-focused creative energy spent redecorating the White House, followed by days of severe depressive withdrawal where she would refuse to leave her private quarters. The effortless energy the public worshipped was, in reality, a heavily manufactured, chemically induced illusion. This synthetic stamina was necessary not just for state dinners, but for surviving the daily, grinding humiliations occurring directly within her own home. The White House was not a sanctuary. It was an active theater of betrayal. JFK brought his compulsive sexual habits directly into the executive mansion. He utilized the White House swimming pool for clandestine, highly inappropriate gatherings with low-level staff members. The Secret Service detail was entirely complicit, establishing a covert signaling system. Agents monitored Jacqueline's movements meticulously. If the First Lady unexpectedly left her private quarters and headed toward the West Wing or the pool, agents would trigger an internal alarm system, allowing the president's companions to scatter before she arrived. Jacqueline was never ignorant of the mechanics of her husband's infidelity. Her personal intelligence network within the White House was formidable. She knew exactly which staffers were covering for him, and she knew the identities of the women. Evelyn Lincoln, the president's fiercely loyal personal secretary, actively facilitated the affairs, managing the private schedules and clearing the Oval Office. Jacqueline despised Lincoln, engaging in a silent, freezing turf war with the secretary over access to the president. Among the rotating cast of women, two specific aides became prominent fixtures. Priscilla Ware and Jill Cowan were two young, attractive secretaries assigned to the White House press office. The senior staff bluntly referred to them by the nicknames Fiddle and Faddle. They had no significant clerical skills, yet they frequently accompanied the president on official trips, swimming with him in the pool and spending hours in his private quarters. Despising the commonality of the hysterical, weeping wife, she weaponized her humiliation, transforming it into acts of calculated, aristocratic cruelty. She asserted her dominance by demonstrating to her husband and his staff that she saw exactly what they were doing, and she held them in absolute contempt. The execution of this dominance was captured in a remarkably chilling incident. In 1961, Jacqueline was conducting a private tour of the White House for a reporter from the elite French magazine, Paris Match. She was impeccably dressed in an Oleg Cassini suit, projecting the absolute zenith of global sophistication. As they walked down a corridor in the West Wing, they passed the desk of Priscilla Ware. Jacqueline did not ignore the young secretary. She did not break her stride. She simply turned her head, gestured smoothly toward Ware, and spoke to the journalist in rapid, flawless French. "This is the girl who supposedly sleeps with my husband." She delivered the line with a perfectly calm, flat intonation. It was a staggering act of psychological violence. By speaking in French, she isolated Ware, who likely did not understand the exact words, but undoubtedly felt the cold impact of the First Lady's gaze. Jacqueline used a foreign press representative to document her own husband's degradation of the office. She was proving that the Kennedy machine could hide the girls, but they could never deceive her. The degradation extended directly into her private sanctuary. Historical documentation later confirmed that a 19-year-old intern named Mimi Alford had her first intimate encounter with the president directly on Jacqueline's own private bed. Forced to navigate a heavily guarded ecosystem of deceit, Jacqueline maintained her focus entirely on her own leverage. She absorbed the absolute humiliation, categorizing these transient women not as genuine rivals, but as symptoms of a flawed system she intended to outlast. She remained the ultimate untouchable authority within the marital contract. This icy detachment functioned effectively for the low-level secretaries and the transient campaign groupies. They possessed no leverage. They could be dismissed, paid off, or ignored. There was, however, one woman who penetrated Jacqueline's armor entirely. One mistress who triggered a state of genuine, suffocating panic. Marilyn Monroe. Monroe was not a disposable secretary. She was a global cultural phenomenon, wielding a level of public influence that rivaled the presidency itself. She was also deeply unstable, heavily medicated, and obsessively infatuated with John F. Kennedy. Monroe sincerely believed that the president intended to divorce Jacqueline and marry her. For Jacqueline, Monroe represented a catastrophic existential threat to the entire Camelot enterprise. If a 19-year-old intern went to the press, the Kennedy machine could easily destroy her credibility. If Marilyn Monroe called a press conference and announced she was sleeping with the President of the United States, she possessed the star power to obliterate the administration overnight. The $1 million contract Jacqueline had negotiated with Joe Sr. would become worthless if the Kennedy brand was publicly detonated. The threat materialized in a direct, unprecedented confrontation. The actor Peter Lawford, who was married to JFK's sister Patricia and acted as the president's Hollywood fixer, had facilitated the affair. Through these channels, Monroe acquired the highly classified direct phone number to the First Lady's private quarters in the White House. Monroe initiated the call. She bypassed the Secret Service switchboard and spoke directly to Jacqueline Kennedy. According to accounts later verified by close associates of the family, Monroe did not apologize. She confidently informed the First Lady that Jack had explicitly promised to leave his family, divorce her, and install Monroe as the new First Lady. A conventional spouse might have screamed, hung up, or demanded a confrontation with her husband. Jacqueline deployed a far more lethal tactic. She utilized a technique of radical freezing agreement. She responded to the biggest movie star in the world with the clinical detachment of a corporate manager discussing a shift change. "That's great, Marilyn," Jacqueline replied softly. "You'll move into the White House. You'll assume the responsibilities of First Lady, and I'll move out and you'll have all the problems." She then hung up the phone. Behind the brilliant retort, the reality was a state of sheer terror. Jacqueline knew exactly how reckless her husband was. She knew Monroe was volatile. For months, the First Lady lived in a constant state of high-alert anxiety, waiting for the scandal to break and destroy the empire she had sacrificed her physical health to build. She conspicuously absented herself from the infamous May 1962 Democratic fundraising gala at Madison Square Garden, taking her children to the Virginia countryside, while Monroe sang a breathy, highly suggestive rendition of Happy Birthday to the president on national television. Jacqueline refused to be physically present for the humiliation. The anxiety only evaporated in August 1962, when Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home from a barbiturate overdose. The threat was neutralized. The secret remained contained. The Kennedy machine continued to operate at maximum velocity. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 pushed the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation, cementing JFK's legacy as a brilliant statesman. Jacqueline's televised tour of the restored White House earned her an Emmy Award, solidifying her status as the ultimate cultural icon. The chemical injections from Dr. Jacobson continued. The affairs continued. The flawless, smiling facade remained completely intact. Up to this point, the transaction she made with Joe Sr. was holding. She was enduring the betrayals, and she was reaping the immense global power of her position. The physical and emotional damage was severe, but it was strictly compartmentalized. But the biological toll of the marriage was not finished with her. The toxic environment created by her husband's lifestyle was about to demand another sacrifice. In the summer of 1963, a fifth pregnancy would force her back into a hospital operating room, and the 39 hours that followed would break the cold equilibrium of her mind entirely, setting the stage for a tragic sequence of events that would ultimately lead her to a bloody limousine in Dallas, August 7, 1963. A fleet of Secret Service agents scrambles across the manicured lawns of Squaw Island in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. The First Lady of the United States is doubled over in excruciating pain. She is alone. The President is 500 miles away in Washington, D.C. She is rushed not to a civilian facility, but to the heavily guarded utilitarian medical wing of Otis Air Force Base. She is 5 weeks premature with her fifth pregnancy. The public was accustomed to seeing Jacqueline Kennedy gliding through European palaces in Oleg Cassini gowns. The physical reality of this afternoon was starkly different. She was strapped to a military hospital gurney, placed under heavy anesthesia, and her abdomen was surgically sliced open in an emergency cesarean section. At 12:52 p.m., Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was pulled from his mother's body. He weighed just 4 pounds, 10.5 ounces. He emitted a faint, reedy cry, and then his skin rapidly began to turn a terrifying shade of blue. The Kennedy administration is typically evaluated by its handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis or the advancement of civil rights, rarely examining its absolute helplessness in the face of biological failure. The tragedy of Patrick Kennedy strips away the myth of Camelot's invincibility, exposing the catastrophic limits of power and wealth. This 39-hour window fundamentally shattered the cold, transactional equilibrium Jacqueline had so carefully constructed. Her aristocratic armor could deflect the humiliation of her husband's infidelity, but it could not withstand the mechanical failure of her infant's lungs. The medical diagnosis was hyaline membrane disease, known today as respiratory distress syndrome. In 1963, it was essentially a death sentence for premature infants. The pathology is brutal and mechanical. The infant's lungs lack a crucial lubricating fluid called surfactant. Without it, the microscopic air sacs in the lungs collapse entirely after every single exhalation. To take the next breath, the infant must exert the sheer physical force of inflating a collapsed, wet balloon. Every breath is a battle. Eventually, the infant simply exhausts its energy reserves and suffocates. Dr. John Walsh, Jackie's obstetrician, immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of the situation. While Jacqueline lay unconscious in the recovery room, a frantic medical evacuation was orchestrated. The infant was placed in a specialized incubator, loaded onto a military helicopter, and flown to Boston Children's Hospital. When John F. Kennedy arrived at the hospital in Boston, he did not project the charismatic authority of the commander-in-chief. Observers noted he looked physically hollowed out. He was escorted to the basement of the hospital, into a room dominated by a massive, terrifying piece of experimental mid-century medical technology, a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. It resembled a massive steel submarine. Inside the pressurized steel drum, his newborn son lay completely exposed, struggling violently for oxygen. For once in his life, the most powerful man in the free world faced a crisis he could not charm, purchase, or legislate his way out of. The Kennedy patriarch, Joe Sr., could buy elections and silence mistresses with million-dollar trust funds. He could not buy surfactant for his grandson's lungs. Jack stood by the heavy glass portal of the chamber, helplessly watching the frantic rise and fall of the infant's chest. Back at Otis Air Force Base, Jacqueline woke up in a sterile military ward. She was informed that her son was in critical condition in another city. The physical trauma of the emergency C-section left her immobilized, tethered to intravenous lines, unable to travel to her dying child. The psychological isolation was absolute. She had built her entire survival strategy on the premise of control. She controlled her image, her silence, her physical spaces. Now her body had failed, and she was entirely powerless. For 39 agonizing hours, the White House press office issued highly sanitized, carefully worded bulletins attempting to manage the optics of a dying baby. Behind the scenes, the medical staff knew the situation was terminal. In the early hours of August 9, 1963, the exhaustion overtook the infant. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy died inside the steel chamber. Jack retreated to a boiler room in the basement of the hospital, away from his Secret Service detail and the medical staff, and wept uncontrollably. He then faced the grim task of flying back to Cape Cod to deliver the news to his wife. When Jack entered the recovery room at Otis Air Force Base and sat on the edge of Jacqueline's bed, the carefully maintained, transactional boundaries of their marriage temporarily collapsed. Aides outside the door reported hearing the First Lady sobbing with a raw, primal devastation that completely shattered her usual composed silence. Jack knelt beside the bed, burying his face in her hands. For a brief, tragic window, the political machinery stopped, and they were simply two broken parents. But grief does not erase deep-seated psychological architecture. It amplifies it. The death of Patrick pushed Jacqueline into a profound, paralyzing clinical depression. She returned to the White House not as the radiant cultural icon, but as a ghost. The amphetamine injections from Dr. Jacobson could provide physical stamina, but they could not repair a shattered psyche. She spent days locked in her private quarters, refusing to look at official schedules, refusing to entertain guests. Her hamartia, her obsessive need to project flawless strength, turned inward, becoming a suffocating trap. She felt entirely defective. She required an escape. Not just a vacation, but a total extraction from the suffocating pressure of the American political machine and the grief-soaked walls of the White House. The mechanism for this extraction arrived through a deeply controversial channel. Her younger sister, Lee Radziwill, intervened. Lee recognized the severity of Jacqueline's depression and proposed a highly unorthodox solution. Lee was actively involved in an affair with the Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis. Onassis, recognizing a historic opportunity to ingratiate himself with the American power structure, formally offered his legendary luxury yacht, the Christina, for the First Lady's private convalescence. The political optics of this offer were utterly radioactive. John F. Kennedy and his Attorney General brother, Robert F. Kennedy, were acutely aware that Onassis was a highly problematic figure. The Greek billionaire had previously been indicted by the United States government for criminal fraud and had built his empire on ruthless, often illegal maritime practices. The FBI maintained thick, active dossiers on his operations. A sitting First Lady accepting the hospitality of an indicted foreign oligarch was a massive political liability. Especially with the 1964 re-election campaign looming, Jack aggressively attempted to block the trip. He offered alternative vacations, private estates in Newport, secure government compounds. But Jacqueline deployed her power with absolute unyielding finality. She did not argue policy. She simply weaponized her grief. She informed her husband that if he denied her this specific escape, he would bear the full responsibility for her complete psychological collapse. She was cashing in the moral debt he owed her, not just for Patrick, but for Arabella, for the mistresses, for the biological risks he had forced upon her. Jack capitulated. He could not deny a grieving mother. In October 1963, Jacqueline Kennedy boarded the Christina. The yacht functioned as a floating, sovereign fortress of grotesque opulence. It featured gold-plated fixtures, original El Greco masterpieces hanging in the dining room, and bar stools famously covered in the foreskins of minke whales. It was an environment of staggering, limitless wealth that completely dwarfed the political constraints of Washington. On board the Christina, the rules of Camelot did not apply. The Secret Service detail was marginalized. The press was locked out. Aristotle Onassis showered the First Lady with intense, undivided attention. Elevating her beyond a political prop or a fragile invalid, he treated her as an absolute monarch. He flooded her suite with rare flowers, presented her with massive, unrecorded jewels, and demonstrated the supreme power of private, unregulated capital. The public in America viewed the trip with deep suspicion. Republican lawmakers openly criticized the First Lady's association with a known criminal operator. But Jacqueline ignored the backlash completely. This Mediterranean cruise was a critical pivot point in her psychological development. While drifting through the Aegean Sea, she realized a terrifying truth. The presidency of the United States offered immense visibility, but it offered zero actual protection. The White House could not protect her babies from dying. The Secret Service could not protect her from the humiliation of her husband's infidelities. Political power was inherently fragile, dependent on the whims of the electorate and the strict rules of public optics. Aristotle Onassis represented a different kind of power. His wealth was private, immune to elections, and aggressively fortified. He commanded his own fleet of ships, his own private island, his own airline. On that yacht, the seed of her ultimate escape was permanently planted. She realized that if she ever needed to completely disappear from the American political machine, this Greek oligarch possessed the exact infrastructure required to facilitate her defection. And that very habit of seeking sanctuary in impenetrable wealth would soon be tested in a manner far more violent than she could ever anticipate. She returned to Washington in early November 1963. Her depression had eased, replaced by a cold, renewed, pragmatic energy. Jack was deeply relieved by her return. He was preparing to launch his re-election campaign, and he needed his ultimate political asset by his side. Recognizing the political damage caused by the Onassis cruise, Jacqueline agreed to make a rare domestic political trip to help her husband secure a fractured voting bloc in a vital southern state. She agreed to pack her bags, including a highly recognizable pink Chanel suit, for a 2-day swing through Texas. The 39 hours of Patrick's life had broken her domestic illusions. The Mediterranean cruise had shown her an alternative reality of absolute private power. She was stepping onto Air Force One in November 1963, not as the naive debutante of the 1950s, but as a woman who fully understood the brutal mechanics of survival. The stage was meticulously set. The factions in Dallas were waiting, and the violent collision of her public duties and her private trauma was about to be broadcast to the entire world. November 22, 1963. The morning air in Fort Worth, Texas, was surprisingly crisp before the intense southern heat set in. Jacqueline Kennedy prepared for the day with the meticulous, calculating eye of a seasoned political operative. She understood that a campaign trip to Texas was fraught with hostility. The state's Democratic Party was violently fractured, and a significant portion of the conservative electorate viewed the Kennedys with deep suspicion. She needed an aesthetic strategy that projected warmth, accessibility, and unassailable elite status. She selected a vibrant raspberry pink suit with a matching pillbox hat. History universally remembers this garment as a Chanel suit. In reality, it was a highly sophisticated piece of political camouflage. Jacqueline knew that wearing imported French luxury garments on a domestic campaign tour alienated working-class American voters and generated vicious press. To bypass this, the suit was actually a line-for-line reproduction created by the exclusive New York tailoring salon Chez Ninon. The boucle fabric, the gold buttons, and the precise pattern were shipped directly from Coco Chanel's atelier in Paris. But the garment was legally assembled on American soil. She wore it because her husband had explicitly requested it. Jack had told her that the Texas politicians would be wearing drab, gray suits, and he needed her to look brilliant, to physically dominate the visual landscape of the motorcade. She had spent years mastering the art of projecting an impenetrable facade, but as the presidential limousine turned onto Elm Street in Dealey Plaza, the physical reality of political violence shattered her psychological architecture in a fraction of a second. The infamous 8mm Zapruder film presents a horrifying sequence of chaotic movement. However, a clinical analysis of the exact physical responses reveals the total collapse of the human mind under catastrophic trauma. When the fatal third shot struck the president, it did not merely kill him. It caused a catastrophic explosive rupture of the right side of his skull. The interior of the limousine was instantly coated in blood, bone fragments, and brain matter. In that microscopic window of time, Jacqueline Kennedy's behavior fundamentally contradicts the standard human survival instinct. Bypassing every standard survival instinct to take cover, she unbuckled her seatbelt, climbed over the back seat, and crawled out onto the sloping trunk of the moving, accelerating limousine. For decades, the public assumed she was panicking, attempting to flee the vehicle in blind terror. The clinical truth is far more disturbing. This was an acute stress reaction, a profound neurological short circuit. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who sprinted from the follow-up car and threw himself onto the back of the limousine, later testified to exactly what she was doing. Jacqueline was not running away. She was desperately reaching across the slick metal of the trunk to retrieve the blown-off fragments of her husband's skull. Her brain, unable to process the finality of the violence, had reverted to a primal mechanical task. She was trying to gather the pieces to put her husband back together. She would later develop complete, dissociative amnesia regarding this specific act. When the Warren Commission interrogated her, she genuinely had no memory of climbing onto the trunk. Her mind had permanently erased the footage to protect her sanity. The limousine raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital, arriving at Trauma Room 1. The scene inside the hospital was an exercise in futile, chaotic desperation. Doctors scrambled to establish an airway, slipping on the blood that pooled on the linoleum floor. The protocol for presidential security and medical hygiene dictated that the First Lady be removed from the trauma room. Nurses and Secret Service agents gently tried to steer her out into the hallway. She absolutely refused to move. Her hamartia, her unyielding, aristocratic pride, resurfaced, mutated by shock. She anchored herself in the corner of the trauma room, her pink suit soaked in dark red arterial blood. When a well-meaning doctor approached her with a sedative pill and a cup of water, attempting to dull her hysteria, she slapped the cup away. She refused to be medicated. She refused to look away. She forced herself to watch the doctors attempt cardiac massage, watching the physical destruction of the man who had tormented her, betrayed her, and elevated her to the highest peak of global power. When John F. Kennedy was officially pronounced dead, the political machinery of the United States government immediately shifted its focus to the new executive authority, Lyndon B. Johnson. The transition of power during a Cold War crisis had to be instantaneous and visually undeniable. Johnson needed to take the oath of office immediately, before Air Force One departed Dallas for Washington. And this is where Jacqueline Kennedy executes the most profound, chilling manipulation of public optics in the 20th century, Aides, military officials, and Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, recognized the horrific state of Jacqueline's clothing. She was covered in biological tissue. Her face was smeared with dried blood. They gently pleaded with her to change clothes. They offered her a clean, pristine dress that was hanging in her private cabin on the aircraft. They brought her warm, wet towels to wipe the gore from her face and legs. She rejected them all. Her mind had moved past the raw shock of the trauma and settled into a state of cold, calculated prosecution. She realized that the American political establishment was already attempting to sterilize the assassination. They wanted to quickly transition to a clean, orderly swearing-in ceremony. They wanted to wash away the violence and project continuity. Jacqueline determined, with ruthless clarity, that she would not allow them to erase the butchery. When pressured again to change out of the ruined pink suit, her response was delivered with a flat, terrifying composure. No, let them see what they have done. By specifically saying they instead of he, she indicted far more than the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. She was indicting the entire political climate of hatred in Texas, the security apparatus that failed to protect him, and the establishment that was now rushing to replace him. When Lyndon B. Johnson raised his right hand to take the oath of office in the cramped, sweltering stateroom of Air Force One, Jacqueline Kennedy stood exactly to his left. The photograph of that moment is etched into the global consciousness. The towering new president commands the frame, yet the viewer's eyes are immediately drawn to the widow. She intentionally positioned herself so the bloodstains on her skirt were clearly visible to the camera. She understood that Johnson desperately needed her physical presence to legitimize his sudden presidency in the eyes of a traumatized nation. She granted him that legitimacy, but she extracted a massive psychological toll in return. By standing there in her ruined clothing, she weaponized her own trauma. She forced the politicians in the room, the press, and the entire world to look directly at the physical evidence of the murder. For 24 hours, from the hospital in Dallas, through the flight, and during the arrival at Andrews Air Force Base, she wore the blood as an indestructible armor. It was a 24-hour silent protest that permanently defined the visual legacy of the assassination. Upon returning to the White House, she immediately seized absolute dictatorial control over the state funeral. The Kennedy political operatives were paralyzed, but Jacqueline was operating with terrifying efficiency. She bypassed the standard military protocols and dispatched aides to the Library of Congress in the middle of the night to research the exact details of Abraham Lincoln's funeral. She demanded the East Room be draped in black crepe. She ordered the riderless horse, Black Jack, to follow the caisson. She mandated that the family would walk behind the coffin on foot, exposing themselves to the open streets of Washington, ignoring the frantic warnings of the Secret Service, who feared a secondary assassination plot. The public watched her during those 3 days in November and saw the ultimate manifestation of Catholic aristocratic stoicism. Maintaining flawless public dignity, she guided her 2 small children without shedding a single visible tear. She created the myth of Camelot, ensuring her husband would be remembered not as a flawed, chronically ill politician with a disastrous personal life, but as a martyred prince of a golden age. But the gap between the public perception and her internal reality was absolute. The stoicism was an illusion, held together by sheer willpower and an escalating terror of the void she was now facing. The true psychological state of Jacqueline Kennedy in the months following Dallas was not noble grief. It was a violent, suffocating descent into despair. This psychological state is documented through a cache of highly classified, deeply intimate letters she wrote to a Jesuit priest named Father Richard McSorley. In the silence of her new Georgetown home, stripped of the power and protection of the presidency, the adrenaline of the funeral evaporated. The letters to Father McSorley reveal a woman entirely stripped of her aristocratic defenses. She confessed a profound, corrosive hatred for the world. She explicitly wrote that she was bitter against God. The woman who had flawlessly orchestrated a globally televised religious funeral was privately questioning the very foundation of her faith. But the letters exposed something far darker than spiritual doubt. Jacqueline Kennedy was seriously, methodically contemplating suicide. Bypassing standard pleas for spiritual comfort, she interrogated the priest with clinical, theological questions about the mechanics of the afterlife. She wanted to know if she blew her own brains out, would God consider it an unforgivable mortal sin? Would the act of suicide permanently separate her soul from Jack's in eternity? She was actively negotiating the terms of her own death, looking for a religious loophole that would allow her to escape the crushing agony of her survival without forfeiting the chance to see her husband again. She wrote that she felt like a bleeding, open wound that the public insisted on constantly touching. She was a living monument, trapped in the amber of November 22nd. If we look to her family for the source of her emotional support during this period, we find the brutal reality of the Bouvier-Auchincloss conditioning. The aristocratic machine she was raised in allowed no time for actual, messy human grief. Weakness was considered deeply vulgar. Just 8 months after her husband's brains were blown out next to her, Jacqueline was still trapped in a state of profound clinical depression. Her mother, Janet Auchincloss, paid her a visit. Janet did not offer comfort or psychiatric intervention. Instead, observing her daughter's continued misery, Janet delivered a reprimand of staggering cruelty. According to family insiders, Janet looked at the former First Lady and snapped with cold irritation. "Everyone loses Jack. But it's been 8 months. You have to snap out of it." This single line perfectly encapsulates the grotesque environment Jacqueline inhabited. Her mother viewed the assassination not as a world-shattering trauma, but as a social inconvenience that had gone on too long. Jacqueline was expected to pack up her grief, put on a new Chanel suit, and resume her position in the hierarchy. She realized then that no one in her immediate circle, neither the Kennedy political syndicate nor her own blood relatives, was going to protect her. They only cared about the maintenance of the image. The psychological cage had not disappeared with Jack's death. It had simply changed locations, but this state of passive martyrdom could not hold. The instinct for ruthless survival that had allowed her to negotiate million-dollar silence contracts and weaponize. A blood-stained suit was still intact. It was dormant, buried under the trauma of Dallas, but it was about to be violently reawakened. And when the next political assassination struck the Kennedy family, that survival instinct would drive her to completely abandon the American establishment and execute an act of betrayal so severe it would permanently destroy her relationship with her only sister, late 1964. A drafting table in a private architectural studio in Washington, D.C. The young widow of the assassinated president leans over a set of massive blueprints. She is meticulously designing the permanent gravesite for John F. Kennedy at Arlington National Cemetery, specifically engineering the mechanics of the eternal flame. The public, reading the daily newspapers, views this as an act of profound, unending devotion. They see a woman consumed by holy grief, dedicating her life to honoring a martyred prince. The historical reality occurring directly over those blueprints completely shatters the myth of the perpetual mourner. She briefly engaged in a covert affair with architect Jack Warnick and rejected a proposal from British diplomat David Ormsby Gore. They lacked private security infrastructures. She rapidly discarded them, returning her focus to the only entity that still offered her real protection. The remaining Kennedy power structure, specifically her brother-in-law, Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, had become her surrogate. He was the only person on Earth who truly understood the exact, suffocating weight of the trauma she carried. They shared the same psychological ghosts. Bobby stepped in to act as the surrogate father to Caroline and John Jr., and he served as Jacqueline's impenetrable shield against the aggressive, demanding Kennedy patriarch. Joe Sr., the public and the press incessantly whispered about a secret sexual affair between the widow and the brother-in-law. The FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, even monitored their movements, desperate to find evidence of a scandal. Whether the relationship was physical or purely a profound trauma bond is almost irrelevant. The functional reality was that Robert F. Kennedy was Jacqueline's absolute lifeline. He was the sole guarantor of her safety and her status within the American establishment. As long as Bobby was alive and accumulating political power, Jacqueline and her children were protected by the most formidable political machine in the country. In the spring of 1968, Bobby Kennedy launched his own ruthless campaign for the presidency. Jacqueline watched with a mounting, unshakable dread. She understood the American political landscape better than anyone, and she knew the visceral hatred the Kennedy name provoked in certain dark corners of the Republic. She reportedly warned close friends that the country was not ready for another Kennedy, predicting with terrifying accuracy that they would do to Bobby exactly what they did to Jack. On June 5, 1968, her psychological architecture completely and violently collapsed. The Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, the chaotic fluorescent-lit corridor of the hotel kitchen. Sirhan stepped forward with a .22 caliber revolver and fired directly into Robert Kennedy. When the frantic phone call reached Jacqueline in New York, the fragile equilibrium she had maintained for 5 years was instantly obliterated. She was forced to fly to Los Angeles and walk into yet another hospital, Good Samaritan, to face the exact same nightmare. She stood in the intensive care unit and looked at the shattered skull of another Kennedy. When the medical team confirmed that Bobby's brain function had ceased, it was Jacqueline who possessed the cold, clinical authority to advise the family. She reportedly told the doctors to turn off the life support machines. She knew, better than anyone in that room, the grotesque futility of dragging out a public death, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy did not just plunge her back into grief. It triggered a primal, uncontrollable state of absolute paranoia. Her fatal weakness, her obsessive need for control and security, mutated into a fierce survivalist panic. She completely lost faith in the United States government. The Secret Service had failed to protect her husband in Dallas. The police had failed to protect her brother-in-law in Los Angeles. The American establishment was, in her eyes, a massive, incompetent slaughterhouse. Her reaction was captured in a single devastating declaration made to her close aides. "If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets. I want to get out of this country." She realized that the prestige of being a former First Lady offered zero ballistic protection. She needed to extract herself and her children from the United States entirely. She needed a private state. She needed an entity with limitless, untraceable capital, private aviation, and a security apparatus that operated entirely outside the jurisdiction of the American government. Conventional safety was no longer sufficient. Following Dallas, she had engaged in a highly classified affair with the architect Jack Warnicki, but abruptly discarded him upon discovering his massive financial debts. She also flatly rejected a marriage proposal from the prominent British diplomat David Ormsby Gore. A diplomat or an architect, regardless of their devotion, did not control private fleets, offshore accounts, or independent security apparatuses. When the sheer panic of Robert Kennedy's assassination set in, these men offered zero tactical value. There was only one man in her orbit who possessed that specific infrastructure: Aristotle Onassis. Onassis was a Greek shipping oligarch, a man of staggering, almost incomprehensible wealth. He owned Olympic Airways, commanded a massive fleet of supertankers, and ruled his own private, heavily fortified island in the Ionian Sea called Scorpios. He did not rely on government protection. He bought governments. He was crude, ruthless, and entirely immune to the moral judgments of the American press. He was exactly the kind of monster Jacqueline needed to guard her gates. But securing the protection of Aristotle Onassis required Jacqueline to execute the most calculated, cold-blooded betrayal of her entire life. It required her to completely destroy her only sister. Caroline Lee Radziwill had spent her entire existence living in the suffocating shadow of her older sister. While Jacqueline became the global icon of Camelot, Lee was the lesser-known, slightly less successful sibling, constantly scrambling for relevance and financial parity. For years, Lee's primary source of power and leverage was her intimate, long-standing romantic relationship with Aristotle Onassis. Onassis had showered Lee with properties, jewels, and attention. Lee was deeply in love with the oligarch and had fully expected to marry him. She viewed Onassis as her ultimate victory, the one area of her life where she possessed something greater, wealthier, and more powerful than anything Jacqueline had. Jacqueline knew this. She knew exactly what Onassis meant to her sister. Yet, when the panic of Bobby's assassination set in, Jacqueline evaluated the situation with the ruthless pragmatism of a corporate raider. She needed Onassis's fortress. Onassis, in turn, possessed a pathological desire for the ultimate status symbol. He did not just want a beautiful aristocrat. He wanted the Queen of America. He wanted the woman who had defied Khrushchev and enchanted de Gaulle. When Jacqueline signaled that she was available for acquisition, Onassis instantly and brutally discarded Lee Radziwill. The historical consensus regarding this maneuver is chilling. This was not a desperate woman accidentally falling in love with her sister's boyfriend. This was a highly calculated transaction, and many insiders viewed it as a delayed, lethal act of vengeance. The brilliant historian and family confidant Gore Vidal, who observed the Bouvier sisters for decades, offered a ruthless assessment of the marriage. Vidal noted that the toxic rivalry installed by their father, Blackjack Bouvier, had never died. More importantly, it was an open secret within elite circles that in the 1950s, Lee Radziwill had allegedly engaged in a brief, covert sexual affair with John F. Kennedy while he was married to Jacqueline. Jacqueline never addressed the rumor publicly. She never screamed or threw accusations. She simply waited. Her hamartia demanded absolute dominance, and her memory for slights was flawless. By deliberately targeting and marrying Aristotle Onassis, Jacqueline executed the ultimate retaliation. She stripped Lee of her billionaire, her future security, and her pride, entirely humiliating her on a global stage. It was a multi-million-dollar act of revenge that permanently, irreparably severed the bond between the two sisters. Jacqueline would later solidify this freeze-out by explicitly writing Lee out of her final will, ensuring her sister received absolutely nothing from her estate. The announcement of the impending marriage in October 1968 detonated across the globe like a cultural bomb. The American public felt a profound, violent sense of betrayal. The widow of their martyred president was abandoning the country to marry a foreign oligarch whom the Department of Justice had previously investigated for fraud. Newspapers ran massive, black ink headlines screaming, "Jackie, how could you?" and "The end of Camelot." The Kennedy syndicate was apoplectic. Rose Kennedy, the matriarch, was horrified. The political operatives viewed it as a catastrophic stain on the Kennedy legacy, treating Onassis like a hostile corporate raider who had stolen their most valuable asset. The Vatican itself intervened. The Catholic Church, which had held Jacqueline up as the paragon of pious widowhood, publicly threatened her with excommunication. Onassis was a divorced man whose first wife was still living, making the marriage a severe violation of Catholic doctrine. Jacqueline ignored all of it. The press, the Kennedys, the Pope, none of them could stop a bullet. None of them could offer the absolute, impenetrable security she required. On October 20, 1968, the rain poured down on the private island of Scorpios. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy stood in a tiny candlelit Greek Orthodox chapel, wearing a beige lace Valentino dress, and bound herself to Aristotle Onassis. She signed the heavily negotiated prenuptial contracts, securing a massive, immediate financial payout and a guaranteed monthly allowance that dwarfed the wealth of most small nations. She traded the myth of Camelot for the hard, cold reality of a billionaire's fortress. She boarded his yacht and flew on his private airlines, believing she had finally outsmarted the systems that had repeatedly victimized her. She believed she had purchased absolute control, but the fatal flaw in her calculation was the nature of the man she had just married. Unlike John F. Kennedy, Aristotle Onassis operated entirely outside the rules of American political optics. Unconcerned with public approval, he possessed a capacity for cruelty that far exceeded the polished betrayals of the White House. Jacqueline assumed she was buying a sanctuary. In reality, she had just locked the door to a Mediterranean cage, and the man holding the key was about to initiate a campaign of psychological warfare and public humiliation that would make the scandals of Washington look like amateur theatrics. The private island of Skorpios in the Ionian Sea was not a romantic sanctuary. It was a heavily fortified, privately policed Mediterranean compound. When Jacqueline Kennedy signed the prenuptial agreement with Aristotle Onassis in October 1968, she believed she was purchasing absolute, impenetrable security. She had traded the myth of Camelot, the adoration of the American public, and her standing within the Catholic Church for a billionaire's fortress. The historical consensus often dismisses this period as the era of Jackie O, a glamorous, jet-setting socialite hiding behind oversized sunglasses. The reality behind the security gates of Skorpios was a brutally cold, highly transactional corporate marriage that quickly devolved into a war of psychological attrition. This marriage functioned as a hostile acquisition rather than a romantic union. The legal framework of their arrangement was drafted by armies of elite attorneys. Jacqueline received a massive upfront tax-free payment, a guaranteed exorbitant monthly allowance, and a strictly defined share of his estate. In exchange, Aristotle Onassis acquired the ultimate geopolitical trophy. He did not want a partner. He wanted the Queen of America. He wanted the woman who had captivated the world alongside John F. Kennedy, now serving as a glittering ornament on the deck of his yacht, the Christina, to intimidate his business rivals and legitimize his often ruthless, shadow economy shipping operations. The physical reality of their domestic life reflected this transaction. They did not share a marital bed. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate schedules, and often lived on separate continents. Onassis was in his 60s, exhausted by decades of aggressive corporate warfare, yet still deeply entrenched in his global operations. Jacqueline was a 39-year-old trauma survivor, desperately trying to insulate herself from the violence of the 1960s. Her psychological coping mechanisms, however, underwent a profound and destructive mutation. In the White House, she maintained control through the chemical assistance of Dr. Max Jacobson and the strict curation of her visual aesthetic. In Greece, entirely removed from the constraints of American political optics, her mechanism for exerting control became pathological, hyper-aggressive consumption. She began spending Onassis's money with a ferocity that stunned even the billionaire's accountants. She was not merely buying clothes. She was hoarding commodities as a physical manifestation of her internal void. She weaponized consumption. She would order hundreds of pairs of shoes in a single afternoon, or leave massive crates of custom French couture unopened with their price tags attached. The act of buying was her mechanism for asserting dominance and violently draining his accounts. Aristotle Onassis was a man who worshipped the accumulation of capital. He despised this level of frivolous, unyielding waste. He began auditing her bills, exploding in violent rages over her invoices. The marriage, built entirely on mutual exploitation, instantly fractured. Onassis soon bestowed a vicious, highly public nickname upon his famous wife. He stopped calling her Jacqueline. To his executives, his crew, and his family, he referred to her exclusively as the witch. To punish her, Onassis reverted to the exact same weapon John F. Kennedy had used, but with a crude European brutalism. He publicly resumed his long-standing intense affair with the legendary opera diva Maria Callas. Kennedy had hidden his mistresses in the shadows of the West Wing, terrified of the press. Onassis deliberately paraded Callas in front of the European paparazzi. He dined with her at exclusive restaurants in Paris, ensuring the photographs were splashed across the global tabloids for his wife to see. He wanted to humiliate Jacqueline. He wanted to provoke a hysterical reaction to prove he had broken her aristocratic armor. He severely miscalculated her psychological endurance. Jacqueline's hamartia, her terrifying, unyielding pride, dictated her response. She completely ignored the provocation. She refused to play the role of the jealous, discarded wife. When reporters asked her about Callas, she offered a serene, impenetrable smile and spoke of the opera singer with polite, freezing indifference. She denied Onassis the one thing he craved most, an emotional reaction that acknowledged his dominance. Her absolute silence drove the oligarch into a state of furious, vengeful desperation. He realized that financial threats and public infidelity could not penetrate her facade. If he wanted to destroy her composure, he had to attack the one asset she valued above all else, her flawless, globally worshipped image of untouchable dignity. In late 1971, Onassis executed an act of marital sabotage so severe and meticulously planned that it remains one of the most grotesque betrayals in the history of modern celebrity. He decided to weaponize her own privacy against her. Onassis maintained absolute security over the island of Scorpios. It was impossible for unauthorized vessels or photographers to breach the perimeter without the billionaire's explicit knowledge and permission. Yet, Onassis personally contacted a crew of aggressive Italian paparazzi. He did not merely give them a tip. He provided them with military-grade logistical intelligence. He supplied the photographers with highly detailed maps of the island's coves. He gave them the exact coordinates of a secluded beach where he knew his wife preferred to relax. Most chillingly, he provided them with the precise daily schedule of her routine, detailing exactly when she would walk down to the water and swim fully exposed in the Ionian Sea. The paparazzi, armed with high-powered telephoto lenses, crept through the Mediterranean brush and waited exactly where Onassis had instructed them. They captured highly intrusive, crystal-clear photographs of the former First Lady of the United States completely naked. When the images hit the international press, eventually being purchased and published by Larry Flynt in a notorious 1975 issue of Hustler magazine, catapulting the pornographic empire to massive success, the humiliation was absolute. The global public, who still viewed her as the grieving, veiled widow of Arlington National Cemetery, was shocked. This was not a security failure. It was an inside job, orchestrated by her own husband. Onassis had deliberately engineered the sexual degradation of his wife to strip away her aristocratic mystique, devalue her public brand, and humiliate her into submission. He wanted to prove that he owned her, body and image, and could destroy both at his whim. Yet, even in the face of this staggering violation, Jacqueline did not break. She compartmentalized the trauma, retreated further behind her oversized sunglasses, and simply spent more of his money. The Cold War on Scorpios settled into a bitter stalemate. Then, the biological fragility that had destroyed her life in the White House struck the Onassis empire with catastrophic force. On January 22, 1973, a Piaggio P.136L-2 amphibious plane took off from the airport in Athens. At the controls was Alexander Onassis, Aristotle's 24-year-old son and the sole male heir to his massive global empire. Alexander was his father's absolute pride, the entire reason Onassis had built his shipping dynasty. Moments after takeoff, the aircraft suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. The plane banked violently to the right, plummeted, and smashed into the runway. Alexander sustained massive, irreversible trauma to his brain and skull. When Aristotle Onassis arrived at the hospital in Athens, the man who controlled politicians and owned islands was reduced to a frantic, weeping father. He refused to accept the terminal prognosis. He utilized his limitless wealth to fly in the world's elite neurosurgeons from the United States and the United Kingdom, demanding they perform a miracle. The surgeons examined the shattered skull and informed the billionaire that there was absolutely zero brain function. The heir was gone. The oligarch was forced to give the order to disconnect his own son from the life support machines. The death of Alexander fundamentally destroyed Aristotle Onassis. His physical health collapsed instantly, ravaged by grief. But within the Onassis family, the grief quickly mutated into a vicious, targeted paranoia. Alexander's sister, Christina Onassis, had despised Jacqueline from the moment she arrived in Greece. Christina viewed the American widow as a parasite. Now, standing over her brother's grave, Christina weaponized her hatred, formulating a devastating psychological attack against her stepmother. Christina publicly and vehemently accused Jacqueline of bringing a supernatural contagion to their family. She pointed to the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, the death of Patrick Kennedy, and now the horrific death of Alexander Onassis. Christina branded Jacqueline the Black Widow. She relentlessly whispered into her grieving father's ear that Jacqueline carried the Kennedy curse, an aura of violent death that infected anyone who stood too close to her. Christina explicitly warned her father that if he did not rid himself of the American woman, she would eventually kill them all. Broken by grief, heavily medicated, and desperate to assign blame for the mechanical failure of the airplane, Aristotle Onassis began to believe his daughter. He became deeply superstitious, viewing his wife not as a trophy, but as a harbinger of death. The man who had orchestrated the paparazzi humiliation now wanted to orchestrate her complete financial and legal annihilation. He isolated Jacqueline entirely. He cut her monthly allowance drastically. He hired a team of ruthless private investigators, including the infamous American lawyer Roy Cohn, to dig through her private life, searching for any evidence of infidelity or breach of contract that would allow him to void the prenuptial agreement entirely. Onassis was determined to divorce her, humiliate her in the global courts, and cast her out of the Greek Empire with nothing but a fraction of the wealth she had grown accustomed to. By the winter of 1974, the divorce papers were actively being drafted in Athens. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the woman who had fled America to secure an impenetrable financial fortress, found herself completely trapped. The gates of Scorpios had locked from the outside. She was facing the terrifying prospect of being discarded by a vengeful billionaire, stripped of her assets, and forced to return to the United States as a twice-widowed, publicly humiliated exile. Her strategy for absolute control had resulted in total vulnerability. The legal traps were set. The Kennedy curse was officially on trial, but just as Aristotle Onassis prepared to execute his final, lethal strike against his wife, the fragile mechanics of human biology intervened to alter the course of legal history once again. March 15, 1975. Aristotle Onassis died of respiratory failure at the American Hospital of Paris. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was not sitting by his bedside. She was in New York, skiing in New Hampshire with her children. When the call came that her husband had died at the age of 69, the global press instantly attacked her absence, framing her as the ultimate cold-blooded gold digger who couldn't even be bothered to watch her benefactor die. The reality was far more calculating. She knew the divorce papers were being finalized in Athens. She knew that Onassis and his daughter, Christina, were actively plotting to strip her of her assets and cast her out of the family with a minor, legally required stipend. Jacqueline did not rush to Paris to mourn. She stayed in New York to rapidly mobilize her legal strategy. The biological clock of Onassis' failing body had beaten the legal clock of the Greek courts. Because the divorce was never formally filed, she was legally a widow, not a discarded ex-wife. Christina Onassis, now the sole heir to the massive shipping empire, was consumed by a blinding hatred for her stepmother. Relying on a newly passed Greek law designed specifically to limit the inheritance of foreign spouses, Christina offered Jacqueline a relatively insulting settlement of $2 million, demanding she waive all further claims to the Onassis estate. Christina expected the American widow to take the money and retreat quietly to avoid a global scandal. She severely underestimated Jacqueline's psychological architecture. Jacqueline's hamartia, her unyielding pride and absolute requirement for total security, was fully engaged. She did not retreat. She launched a brutal, bare-knuckle legal war. Jacqueline hired an elite team of international litigators. She threatened to bypass the Greek legal system entirely and drag the Onassis corporate empire into the American courts. She threatened to publicly expose the shadowy, highly complex financial structures and tax evasion tactics Aristotle Onassis had utilized for decades. She weaponized the one thing Christina feared most, the catastrophic devaluation of the shipping company, through American federal scrutiny. The standoff lasted for 18 months of intense, hostile negotiations. Finally, Christina capitulated. To protect the empire and silence her stepmother permanently, Christina agreed to pay Jacqueline a staggering $26 million in a tax-free settlement. At 46 years old, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis walked away from the wreckage of the Greek Empire with absolute, unassailable financial independence. No Kennedy patriarch dictating her schedule. No Greek oligarch threatening to leak her photographs. She had finally purchased the fortress she had been seeking since she was an 11-year-old girl, watching her parents' marriage collapse. And then, she did something that shocked the global elite entirely. With millions in the bank, she decided to get a job, eschewing predictable vanity charities or fashion ventures. She took a position as a junior consulting editor at Viking Press in New York City. Her starting salary was a meager $200 a week. This was not a publicity stunt. It was a profound psychological pivot. For her entire adult life, her value had been strictly defined by the powerful men she stood next to. Her body and her image had been treated as corporate collateral. Now, she wanted a localized, mundane control. She sat in a small, windowless office. She brewed her own coffee. She answered her own phone, famously whispering Jacqueline Onassis to stunned literary agents. She actively acquired historical biographies and art books, guiding them through the grueling editing process. Her unyielding moral boundaries remained fully intact. In 1977, Viking Press decided to publish a fictionalized thriller called Shall We Tell the President? By Jeffrey Archer, a book that explicitly depicted an assassination plot against her brother-in-law, Senator Ted Kennedy. Jacqueline viewed the publication as a grotesque capitalization on her family's trauma. She did not scream or demand the book be pulled. She quietly typed a letter of resignation, cleared out her desk, and left Viking immediately on principle. She subsequently moved to Doubleday, where she worked as a senior editor for the next 15 years. During this era, she finally secured a romantic partnership that was not based on political leverage or financial survival. She found Maurice Tempelsman, a Belgian-born industrialist and diamond merchant. Tempelsman was immensely wealthy, but he was quiet, deeply intellectual, and actively shunned the press. Crucially, he was separated from his wife, but she refused to grant a divorce on strict religious grounds. Jacqueline did not care. She did not require a legal document or a massive wedding to validate the relationship. They simply lived together in her Fifth Avenue apartment. For the first time in her life, she chose peace over power. Tempelsman offered no political campaigns, no foreign intelligence dossiers, and no public humiliation. He offered quiet devotion, but the biological fragility of the human machine always demands the final word. In late 1993, while fox hunting in Virginia, the 64-year-old Jacqueline was thrown from her horse. During the medical examination for her injuries, doctors discovered a swollen lymph node in her right groin. The biopsy results were devastating. She had advanced non-Hodgkin lymphoma. The cancer was aggressively attacking her lymphatic system. She underwent harsh chemotherapy regimens at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. Templesman remained constantly by her side, holding her hand while the chemical toxins were pumped into her veins. The woman who had maintained absolute physical perfection for the cameras began to rapidly lose her hair, her weight, and her legendary vitality. By April 1994, the cancer had aggressively metastasized, spreading into her liver, her spinal cord, and her brain. The medical team offered desperate experimental interventions to marginally prolong her life. It is in this final moment that her lifelong obsession with absolute control reaches its ultimate tragic zenith. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis refused the treatments. She had watched John F. Kennedy die in a chaotic, bloody trauma room in Dallas. She had watched Robert Kennedy die on a sterile ventilator in Los Angeles. She had watched her infant son suffocate in a hyperbaric chamber. She refused to allow her own death to be a medical spectacle. She looked at her doctors, ordered them to cease all aggressive treatments, and demanded to be taken home to Fifth Avenue. She wanted to dictate the exact terms of her surrender. On May 19, 1994, surrounded by her children and Maurice Templesman, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died in her sleep, retaining absolute, final control over her own existence. Her legacy is not defined by passive victimization or the tragedies of her obstetric history. Behind the absolute public silence was a formidable political architect. She laid the groundwork for the National Endowment for the Arts, directed the historic preservation of the White House, and secured an Emmy. She navigated and outlasted the most treacherous political and financial systems of the 20th century. She entered the historical record not as the beautiful prop of Camelot, but as the ultimate manifestation of ruthless survival, systemic manipulation, and impenetrable autonomy.